Hello, and welcome to this industry-presented webinar, Sleep Tactics for Better Performance. A few housekeeping announcements before we get started. After viewing this presentation, you will have the opportunity to take a short survey where you can also post a question for the presenter and complete a 15-question self-test for your CEC. Upon successfully passing the self-test, you will receive a CEC certificate via email awarding your CEC, and your CEC will automatically be added to your ACSM profile. Today's webinar is presented by Gatorade Sports Science Institute. Founded in 1985, the Gatorade Sports Science Institute is committed to helping athletes optimize their health and performance through research, education, and service in hydration and nutrition science. GSSI's primary objective is to study the effects of nutrition on the human body before, during, and after exercise, and lead, enhance, and develop sports fuel innovations. For more than 3 decades, GSSI has worked with thousands of elite, professional, and amateur athletes to evaluate their fueling needs and provide recommendations to help improve their performance. GSSI collaborates with universities and researchers around the world to publish hundreds of peer-reviewed research papers. To help educate athletes, their influencers, and the sports science community, GSSI provides educational materials, research news, and various sports resources. For more information, please visit www.gssiweb.org. Today's webinar presenter is Amy Bender. Dr. Bender is an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Calgary and the Faculty of Kinesiology. She received her PhD and Master of Science degree in experimental psychology from Washington State University, specializing in sleep EEG. She has developed sleep optimization strategies for numerous Canadian Olympic and professional teams and is now using her expertise to understand how sleep interventions can improve mental health outcomes. It is with great pleasure that we present to you Dr. Amy Bender.
Well, my name is Dr. Amy Bender. I am a sleep scientist, and I've worked with a number of athletes and professional and Olympic teams to optimize their sleep. Today, I'm going to talk about sleep tactics for better athlete health and performance. Conflicts of interest. Gatorade Sports Science Institute did sponsor this talk. However, this does not affect the content of the presentation. So learning objectives for today, number 1, to understand what good sleep is. So I'm going to be talking about the 3 keys for optimal sleep: quantity of sleep, quality of sleep, and timing of sleep. I'm also going to dispel sleep myths and how to translate that knowledge to the athletes that you're working with. I'm going to talk about how to implement a sleep screening strategy and what to do when you identify an athlete with a sleep problem. And then lastly, to be able to implement other sleep strategies, I'm going to again, talk about quantity, quality, and timing, but we're also going to talk about other strategies, including banking sleep and napping. So there's 3 main parts to this presentation. The first part is the science of sleep. So I'm going to discuss what happens when we sleep, why we sleep, what's going on. Part 2, we're going to talk about sleep and injury and illness. So this webinar primarily for athletic trainers, but hopefully I'll be touching on other parts for other practitioners as well. But I want to focus on sleep and injury and sleep and illness. And then in part 3, I'm going to talk about the different sleep tactics. So as I mentioned, the banking sleep, the napping, a pre-sleep routine, and talk a little bit about caffeine. So riddle of the day, this naturally occurring performance enhancer has been proven to improve mood, boost alertness, reduce injury risk, build immunity, and help build and repair tissues. It costs nothing and is freely available. What is it? Vitamin Z. So that's right. Vitamin Z, it's pretty incredible that one of the biggest performance enhancers out there is freely available and costs nothing. Yet so many people ignore the benefits. They think wasting time, sleeping is unproductive, and that's furthest from the truth. So I'm hoping that this module will convince you otherwise. Let's start off with this important question. Why do we sleep? Well, we don't really know the answer to this, and many sleep scientists debate this question, and yet there's no real consensus as to why we actually sleep. Sleep scientist pioneer Dr. Alan Rechtshafen pointed out nicely that if sleep doesn't serve some vital function, it is the biggest mistake evolution ever made. So we spend about a third of our lives sleeping, which is a huge amount of time to be vulnerable to predators, not gathering food, not reproducing. So there must be an important function of sleep. And although we debate why we sleep, most of the theories have to do with restoring the brain and body from wakefulness. So let me give you two key examples. Sleep affects nearly every cell in our body, all the way down to our DNA. So this particular study by Chung in 2019 found that when on-call physicians slept only 4 hours, there were decreases in DNA repairs and antioxidant capacity, resulting in a 25% increase in DNA breakage. And this was the result of just one night of sleep loss. Another important study showed that our brain acts like a dishwasher when we sleep. So as it turns out, the brain cells that surround our neurons, called glial cells, shrink during sleep. And why is this? Well, they think that it allows more space in the brain to wash out toxins such as beta amyloid and tau from the brain. And it's hypothesized that those who continually do not get enough sleep are at more risk for Alzheimer's disease. Now let's get into what actually happens when we sleep. So if you're lucky, you hit the pillow, wake up 7 to 8 hours later, but while you're laying there, a lot has gone on. In fact, during sleep, some parts of the brain are more active than when we are awake. Now, the gold standard way that we measure sleep is through EEG, or electroencephalography. And this is just looking at the electrical activity of the brain, the neurons, the collection of neurons, and what are the patterns are occurring when we're sleeping. So our sleep is divided into two main parts, non-REM sleep as well as REM sleep. So I'm first going to talk about non-REM sleep. So we start off in stage N1. So this stage takes up about 5% of our sleep time across the night. This is the lightest stage of sleep. When you're first falling asleep, you go into stage 1. And when you wake up throughout the night, you'll then go back into stage 1 first. So the second stage of sleep that we get into is called non-REM stage 2 sleep, which takes up about 50% of our sleep time across the night. Our breathing and heart rate become regular, our body temperature drops, and we start to see K complexes, these pointed waves in the EEG, as well as sleep spindles, which are these squiggly lines that you'll see occurring during stage 2. Sleep spindles in particular protect the sleeper from external noises, so the more frequent the spindles, the less the person wakes up during the night. After non-REM stage 2, we go into non-REM stage 3. So this stage is the deepest stage of sleep where the brain waves are very large, they're very slow. It's difficult to wake someone up during this stage. This stage is where tissues are being repaired, growth hormone is being released, and it's highly involved in memory consolidation. It's a place where new facts and skills are stored and strengthened. And in fact, studies have shown that enhancing deep sleep with sound makes the brain waves higher and bigger and actually strengthens memory in older adults. And as we age, we get a dramatic decrease in slow wave sleep, which is also associated with memory decline. So interventions used to boost deep sleep, such as exercise, this acoustic stimulation, which I talked about, may be helpful for improving memory. The next stage of sleep, after non-REM stage 3, we'll typically go back into non-REM stage 2, and then we'll get into REM sleep. So this is where we are actively dreaming. And although we can dream in any stage of sleep, this is where you'll wake up in the morning, remember your dream, more of a movie story-like dream that's occurring during this stage of sleep. And it takes around 90 minutes from the time you fall asleep to get into this stage. And as you go on in the night, we start to see more REM periods occurring during the later half of the night. During this stage, this is where the brain is very active and brainwaves look similar to when you are awake. Your breathing and heart rate becomes irregular, and your muscles become paralyzed so that you don't act out your dreams. This stage of sleep is also involved in memory and is known to integrate new information with past experiences to help you solve problems and gain insights. So if someone is cutting off their sleep, typically they'll lose out on a lot of that REM sleep that's occurring. And so there may be more impairment in the ability to solve problems. On this next slide, slide 9, we're looking at sleep cycles and how the sleep stages progress throughout the night. So first we'll see stage 1 sleep. We'll start off being awake, obviously, and then we'll move on into stage 1 sleep. We'll have a couple of minutes of stage 1. Then we'll move on to stage 2 sleep, a couple of minutes of stage 2. And then we're into that deepest stage of sleep, roughly about 30 minutes after you first fall asleep. So we'll have a big period of that stage 3 sleep. And then after that, we'll go into stage 2 and then get into that REM sleep, which is this dark purple bar up here. And as you can see, the REM sleep starts off pretty small. So that's our dreaming sleep. And then as the night goes on, we see longer and longer periods of REM sleep occurring so that at the end of the night, we're more likely to wake up in a dream. If we look at that stage 3 sleep, we'll see most of that occurring in the first half of the night. So this is down here, we see right around the 4-hour mark. Just after that is kind of the last part of that deep stage of sleep that's occurring. And of course, this is just a depiction, a cartoon. We'll see many awakenings occurring during the night. It doesn't look exactly like this, but it kind of gives you an idea of what's going on. And so the cycle 1 would be when we're going from non-REM to REM sleep. And then cycle 2 would be, again, that non-REM to REM sleep. And so we cycle in and out of non-REM to REM sleep approximately 5 to 6 times during the night. And so that is a completed sleep cycle is around that 90-minute mark. So there are 2 main processes that help regulate our sleep. And I'm not going to go too deep into the science here, but I think it's important for you to know that sleep is regulated by these 2 processes. So the first one is process S. This is the homeostatic drive for sleep. So as the day goes on, we have more pressure or more sleep pressure occurring so that right before bedtime, we see the highest levels of sleep pressure occurring, which is related to adenosine production. So adenosine builds up in the brain, and then when we sleep, that adenosine dissipates. But we also have process C, which is the circadian rhythm. So circadian rhythms are occurring in most cells in our body, but we have one master clock, which helps control when we sleep and when we're awake. So that's the suprachiasmatic nuclei in the brain help regulate. That's our master clock. And so this helps determine if someone's a night owl, they likely have a longer circadian period than if someone who is an early bird will have a shorter circadian period. As circadian rhythms relate to sleep, it controls when we're alert and when we're sleepy. So this picture is just showing kind of fluctuations in alertness and sleepiness occurring throughout the day. And this is independent of sleep-wake activity. We also have melatonin as a marker of our circadian rhythm. And with melatonin, we start to see approximately 2 hours before bedtime that first release of melatonin, and then it peaks 5 a.m. in the morning or so, depending on if you're a night owl or an early bird. But that highest release of melatonin is associated with the lowest levels of alertness. So that's important. And light is the most potent regulator of our circadian rhythm. So it's really important to get light in the morning to help set our circadian rhythms to that day, as well as try and block light at night because light impacts our melatonin. And if we're looking at a screen right before bedtime, that's going to start decreasing our melatonin, make it harder to fall asleep, as well as affect our sleep quality throughout the night. So let's get into the 3 keys of optimal sleep. So we're first going to start off with sleep quantity. This is a graph of different ages along the bottom and the amount of sleep that they need across a 24-hour day. So the ideal amount that's recommended is this dark blue color in the middle, and then we have the teal color, which may be appropriate. So for a teen, we're looking at between 8 and 10 hours of sleep required during a 24-hour day. And if we're looking at a young adult, we're looking at between 7 and 9 hours. And then as you age, so an older adult may not need as much sleep as a younger adult, and we're looking at about 7 to 8 hours of sleep. But we think that athletes probably need more sleep than that recommended amount. And here is the depiction of different professional athletes along the bottom with the amount of sleep that they're reporting across a 24-hour day. And what we see is most of these athletes, this white line is kind of a typical sleeper, usually getting about 6 hours, 45 minutes. And what we see across the board here is that most of these athletes, all but Tiger Woods, are getting above that 7-hour mark, and many are getting much more than that. So if we look at Roger Federer, he's reporting between 11 and 12 hours of sleep per night. LeBron James, 12 hours. Maria Sharapova, 8 to 10 hours. And Michelle Wie, 10 to 12 hours. This was... This infographic probably needs updated. I'm actually working on updating that with more relevant athletes. Maybe there's still some really great athletes here who are still competing, but we do have Tiger Woods at about 4 to 5 hours of sleep per night. And I could make a lot of jokes about that. I'm going to refrain from doing so. But during this time, his performance started to tank. So maybe there was a relationship between how much sleep he was getting and his overall performance. But I think the bottom line here, takeaway message from this graph, is that these professional athletes are prioritizing sleep, and they know how important sleep is for their overall recovery and performance. Many people may be thinking, I'm fine, I can get by on less sleep, I'm probably just a short sleeper. But we don't actually think that we can adapt too well to chronic sleep loss and reduce the amount of sleep that we need. What actually happens is you become poorer at recognizing when you are sleep deprived. So research has shown that you're terrible at judging your performance when you're sleep deprived. You think you're doing fine, but in reality, when we look at your performance, you're doing terrible. So many people do believe that I feel fine, I'm doing great, but in reality, it's not likely that that is the case. There was one recent study that looked at a father-son duo who reported to get about 5 hours and 4 hours of sleep per night. And they were waking up refreshed. They had no memory impairments and were just doing great on that little amount of sleep. But when scientists actually looked at how often this gene mutation was occurring, it was actually less than 1 in 4 million people have this gene. And there's been a number of sleep scientists that have said the percent of the population that can get by on 5 hours or less of sleep per night with no performance impairments is about 0%. So in reality, most of us, 99% of us, need to aim for that minimum 7 hours of sleep per night for an adult. So it's not just about the quantity of sleep, but it's also about the quality of sleep that's important. And I love this picture that I took outside a coffee shop. Sleep is a symptom of caffeine deprivation. I'm going to talk a little bit about caffeine later on. So what actually is good quality sleep? This is from the National Sleep Foundation, and their definition is that you're able to fall asleep in less than 30 minutes. You wake up no more than once per night. You're awake for 20 minutes or less during the night after initially falling asleep. And you're sleeping about 85% of the time while you're in bed. Let's take a look at what an example of this might look like. So let's say you go to bed at 11 p.m. You fall asleep within 30 minutes. So you fall asleep at 11:20 p.m. You wake up once during the night, wake up about 3 a.m. to use the bathroom, but then you're back asleep at 3:15 a.m. And then you wake up for the day about 6:45 a.m. So in this instance, person would be falling asleep in less than 30 minutes. They'd be waking up no more than once per night for less than 20 minutes or less. And then they would also be sleeping in bed 85% of the time that they are in bed. And they would be getting that minimum of 7 hours of sleep per night. So this is kind of a good example of what good quality sleep may look like. On a deeper level, it's more than just that. So that's kind of a high level definition of what good quality sleep is. But I think on a deeper level, there can be arousals occurring, awakenings occurring that you may not even realize they're so short that you won't actually remember that you were awake. And this happened to me during grad school. So I was doing a study on smokers trying to quit. And smokers, they're really fond of caffeine as well. So during this study, we allowed them to drink caffeine freely. And what I found with one particular individual is subjectively, he was reporting that caffeine didn't do anything to his sleep. He still slept fine. Caffeine wasn't a problem for him. And as it turned out, one night in the study, he had a coffee literally 30 minutes before bedtime. And then the following day, he didn't. And on that day that he had that coffee, it took him longer to fall asleep. He had more awakenings during the night. He had more stage 1, and it was noticeably different in his sleep quality compared to the night where he didn't have caffeine. And so that's kind of an example of how people may think that caffeine or even electronic devices is not a big deal. But on a much finer level, it could be impacting your overall sleep quality. This is a study that we did in 2018 where we compared the differences between athletes and controls in many different sleep disturbance reasons. Here we have athletes in red, we have controls in blue, and what you see for every single one of these reasons is that the athletes in red are outnumbering the controls for every single reason. If we look at waking up in the middle of the night or the early morning, we see over 80% of the athletes to report this to be a problem versus less than 60% of the controls. Again, having to get up to use the bathroom, more athletes are reporting this versus the controls in blue. And then feeling too hot is a big one, having pain. The athletes are outnumbering the controls in each of these sleep disturbance reasons. And time again in the research, we're seeing that athletes have poor sleep quality versus our controls. So we really have to be giving these athletes strategies to try and deal with some of these sleep disturbances that are occurring. There's many different reasons for poor quality sleep and why that may be the more prevalent in athletes versus controls. Number one, inability to shut their mind off. So many times they're training late, they're having late light exposure, they're having adrenaline, they've just competed in a game. And so inability to shut mind off may be one of the reasons for poor quality sleep. Irregular sleep schedules. Again, I've worked with athletes who have a Monday, Wednesday, Friday strength training session at 6 a.m, which is absolutely crazy. And then on those Tuesday, Thursday, and on the weekends, they're sleeping until, 9 a.m. And so irregular sleep schedules is another reason for poor quality sleep in athletes. There's also travel and jet lag. Athletes are having to travel internationally or even crossing multiple time zones to play in a conference game, for example. So travel and jet lag is another reason for poor quality sleep in athletes. There's also sleep disorders. So football players, rugby players, bigger athletes have a higher likelihood of sleep apnea, which is when you stop breathing during the middle of the night. So there may be a higher prevalence of sleep disorders in athletes than what we see in the general population. Electronic devices before bedtime. Many athletes have contracts, they have sponsorships, that they need to be on social media. I'm not using that as an excuse, but this could be another reason athletes have to be on their phones more. They're probably using it more prior to bedtime, although I would say the general population has a problem with this as well. Substances like alcohol, caffeine, nicotine, all impact all of us when it comes to sleep. But these are substances that athletes could be using. So let's move to the timing of sleep. So chronotype is kind of our natural preference for being a morning type or an evening type. So a lot of times 15% of us are larks. We like to be awake before 6 a.m. We like to go to bed before 9 p.m. And so that would be kind of a definition of those morning types. We also have 15% of us are evening types, or more of that night owl type, where they like to go to bed after midnight and wake up after 8 a.m. And then the rest of us kind of fall in between. So chronotype is based on genetics, but you can control some of the things that are going on and affect your ability to go to sleep earlier or go to sleep later. And a lot of that has to do with timing of light. So for a night owl, we would recommend more light in the morning and then blocking that light at night. So avoiding those electronic devices to help shift their rhythms to an earlier time. Chronotype changes across the lifespan. So we'll see younger children are more morning larks. And then we'll see at around late teens, early adulthood, we'll start to see a peak in night owlness, which is based on those biological changes. So it's not that the teenager is being lazy. It's more about the biology and the changes in the release of melatonin. Then at around age 50, you revert back to being a morning type. So this graph here is just an example of age along the bottom. So kind of those changes across the lifespan when it comes to chronotypes. So we have ages along the bottom, and then we have early chronotypes on the left-hand side, bottom left-hand side. And we have late chronotypes on the top of the left-hand side. And what we see is early on, as I mentioned, we're more early birds when we're younger. And then when we hit those teenage years, early adulthood, we start to see a peak in late evening types, with males having more of a prevalence for an evening type versus females. But that peak in evening type is around age 20. And then we start to revert back as we age around age 50 to more of that early bird type. So that was a brief synopsis of the science of sleep. Remember, sleep serves vital functions for the brain and the body. Many tissues are being repaired during sleep. Memory consolidation is occurring, so it's really important for our brain and body. We know, or you learn, that sleep is regulated by sleep pressure and circadian rhythms. So we have not only the time we've been awake that's a factor in when we want to go to sleep, but also our circadian rhythms and our own internal master clock, which is controlling some of that biology, and when melatonin gets released is also a regulator of our sleep-wake cycles. We also touched on the amount of sleep that people should be getting. The quality of that sleep and the timing are all key factors for optimal sleep. All right, so for part 2, I'm going to talk primarily about how sleep helps athletes stay in the game. This is kind of a basic summary of what happens and how sleep relates to immunity. But what we see is that when the amount of sleep goes down, inflammation goes up, and we have a harder time fighting off infection and pathogens. This is a very relevant slide during this time right now with the coronavirus. And this was done in 2015, a study in 164 adults where they exposed people to the rhinovirus. So this is just the cold virus. And what they found was that they looked at their sleep objectively leading into this exposure. And they found that of those who were getting 7 hours or more of sleep per night, there was about a 17% infection rate when they were exposed to the cold virus. And as sleep got less and less, the chances of infection actually went up. So if we move down to those getting less than 5 hours of sleep per night, there was about a 45% chance of catching that cold versus those who were getting 7 hours or more at about a 17% chance. So it was a kind of a dose-response relationship. The more sleep you got, the less you were likely to catch the cold. With the less sleep you got, the more likely you were to catch the cold. And when fighting an infection, the immune system sends a variety of immune cells into battle, each with different tasks. So T cells primarily work on the front line where they recognize and kill infected cells. And in order for a T cell to kill an infected cell, it first needs to attach itself to the cell. To do this, the T cell activates sticky proteins called integrins, working a bit like grappling hooks. These proteins help the T cells latch onto the infected cells long enough to inject the toxic molecules. So the T cells, they have to recognize the infected cell, they have to attach to the infected cell, and then they have to kill the infected cell. And what they found in this study by Dimitrov, 2019, is that sleep helps killer T cell stickiness. So it helps the T cell stick to that pathogen. And those who were well rested had more of those integrins, that protein, versus those who were sleep deprived had less of that stickiness. That could be a reason, one of the reasons why we see higher rates of infection in those who are getting less sleep. Let's talk about sleep and injury. So that's an important piece to the puzzle when we're talking about athletes trying to stay in the game. In this particular study, they were looking at injury based on hours of sleep per night. So we have hours of sleep along the bottom here in adolescent athletes. And then we have the likelihood of injury over about a 2-year period on the left hand, or that vertical axis. And what they found in this study was that athletes who slept on average less than 8 hours of sleep per night, now remember, these adolescent athletes need to be getting between 8 and 10 hours. So we're talking about those people who were not meeting those recommendations, had about a 2 times greater injury risk of being injured than those who slept equal to or greater than 8 hours. In this particular study, they were looking at sleep as well as an unhealthy diet, and they found that both of these factors increase the risk of injury. In this particular, we're looking at adolescent elite athletes and emailed them this survey on 2 occasions during the school year. This was 340 athletes, elite athletes in the study in Sweden, and they found that with sleeping more than 8 hours of sleep during the weekdays reduced the odds of injuries by 61%. But also when they factored in nutrition intake, so in this particular study, it's in Sweden, so there's a recommended amount of fruits and vegetables as well as fish is a big part of their diet, that reaching the recommended nutrition intake reduced the odds of injury by 64%. So both of these factors play a role in injury risk. If we're looking at sleepiness and career longevity, in this study, in Major League Baseball players, they assessed their levels of sleepiness, and this was in 81 athletes, and they followed up 2 years later to see whether or not they were in the league. And what they found is that about 38% of these athletes were inactive, so that's kind of what we would typically see. But when they look specifically at the group who was clinically sleepy, they found that about 75% were inactive and no longer in the league. So about a 2 times risk of not being in the league when those athletes were clinically sleepy. Okay, so we covered the basic science of sleep. We're looking at how sleep helps athletes stay in the game. Now let's look at part 3, which is sleep tactics. What can you do? I guess before we get to that, I just think it's important for practitioners to realize that they do have more control than they think they do when it comes to an athlete's sleep. So you typically think, sleep is occurring off training where you're not seeing the athlete. You can't really tuck them in at night and know that they're getting enough sleep. It really is up to the athlete to do so. But I think there are some techniques that you can use to emphasize the importance of sleep, especially as how it relates to performance. And I think you have a bit more control than you actually think you do. So let's talk about some of those sleep tactics. Number 1, it's really important to educate and emphasize the importance of sleep. In this particular study, actually there were 3 studies looking at, do sleep information sessions help increase the amount of sleep that athletes are getting? And what they found was that across these 3 studies, there was about a 20-minute increase in sleep duration per night after this sleep information session. Only one of these studies actually looked at following up as to how long these effects last. And they found in KEA that it wasn't maintained 1 month later. So I think that in order to kind of mitigate that, we could have sleep information sessions occurring throughout the season, or just emphasize throughout the season. So not even necessarily a presentation, but a practitioner to check in with their athlete. How are you sleeping? Talk about the benefits and potentially have an actionable individualized plan for each athlete. Again, emphasize sleep, check in frequently. And this was an individualized plan that I developed for speed skaters preparing for the Pyeongchang Olympics. And in this particular plan, the number 1 question I asked is, how much sleep do you think you need to perform your best? And athletes generally intuitively have kind of a number in their mind. And so for this particular athlete, it was about 8 hours of sleep that they needed to perform their best. And then I added about an hour to make sure that we account for the time it takes them to fall asleep, as well as those awakenings occurring during the night. So for this particular athlete, they said they needed 8 hours, but I had them be in bed for 9 hours. And I started at the bottom here. So I took their latest wake up time, which was 7:30 a.m. on their training or competition days. And then I basically subtracted backwards that 9 hours so that their recommended bedtime was 10:30 p.m. About an hour before 10:30, I had a line in here for them to dim the lights, put away their electronic devices, so that they're preparing to sleep. You can't just flip a switch and automatically fall asleep instantly. So we need some time to unwind. So that's why I had about an hour prior to their bedtime, the period of unwinding. And then we also incorporated blue light blocking glasses for this particular athlete in order to preserve that melatonin. And so blue light blocking glasses they're very cheap, they're very inexpensive. I personally recommend them because it's not just about the light from the electronic devices, it's also about the overhead lights that occur. Sometimes there's times where we need to work at night, we need to be on that laptop. And so having those 99% blue light blocking glasses may be a way to help mitigate some of those effects of that bright light occurring. And then we also incorporated a nap. For this particular athlete, they weren't necessarily napping, which we do see very frequently. Only about 20% of athletes are napping 2 to 3 times and up per week. The schedule pretty much stayed the same on their days off. We just kind of incorporated a longer nap opportunity, and consistency of sleep is really important. So that is a key factor for sleep, is to have a consistent sleep schedule. And you may think, how would I ever get an athlete to sleep an hour more per night? Well, it all adds up. So in this particular instance, we wanted them to sleep about 30 minutes more per night than they normally were. You times that by 7, that's 3.5 hours across the week. We incorporated a 20-minute nap 3 times per week, so that's an hour across the week. And then one 90-minute nap on their days off, so that's an hour and a half. And then also an hour sleep in on their day off, for a total of 7 hours across the week. So it's important to keep in mind that it doesn't have to be all a huge chunk of nighttime sleep. We can also incorporate napping as a part of that to get our athletes to sleep more. So the second tip I would say is to monitor sleep and to figure out who actually has a sleep problem. So once we start with the education, which is important to create buy-in, we want to then monitor the sleep of our athletes. So as I mentioned, I worked on the athlete sleep screening questionnaire. This is the only questionnaire that's been validated for athletes. It's not designed to diagnose athletes with sleep disorders, but it's more to identify those athletes with sleep problems and to refer them further to a sleep specialist when they do have a sleep problem. This questionnaire is freely available online. I would recommend everyone go to centerforsleep.com, look for that athlete sleep screening questionnaire, and athletes can put in their email, fill out the questionnaire, takes less than probably about 5 minutes to complete. And then they get sleep education materials, they get individualized recommendations based on their responses, and it helps determine, do they have a problem or not? And these results are emailed to them. They can forward it to their practitioners, the support team that they're working with. And it's really just a great way to quickly online fill out the questionnaire and really realize, do I have a sleep problem or not? When we did this, so we validated this questionnaire in 199 Canadian national team athletes, and we studied their sleep at time 1. So we have ASSQ time 1 at the bottom. And then we studied their sleep about 4 months later. And we found that actually about 5 months later, And we found that their sleep difficulty score, that's on the left-hand side here, that vertical axis, actually decreased after these recommendations. So some of the severe athletes were, moving down more into the moderate category. The moderate were moving down more in the mild category. We didn't really see a change with those who didn't have a sleep problem, because they didn't have a sleep problem to begin with, so there's nowhere really to go. But in general, we found about 25% had moderate to severe sleep issues. But after those recommendations, that sleep improved. Okay, let's talk about banking sleep. This is a huge strategy that we recommend for our athletes, especially leading into important competitions. We want to get more sleep leading into that competition. And studies have shown that it improves performance, bottom line. So better free throw percentage by 9% in this particular study, improved serving accuracy by 6%. In that study, and then reduced reaction time by 4% and cortisol by 19% in rugby players. Again, it doesn't have to be a huge long period, like the whole season they need to bank sleep, although, if you can do it, great. But it can just be a 1 to 2 week period prior to that important competition that we will see improvements in performance. And I will say also that those athletes who have a tendency to be more anxious prior to a competition, maybe that night before they can't get any sleep, this is a good way to help reduce that anxiety. So to let athletes know that, hey, you're getting good sleep leading into this competition. If you get one poor night of sleep right before, it's not going to impact your performance because you did all the work ahead of time. So I think it's also a good strategy to reduce anxiety in those athletes who don't sleep well prior to that big competition. A pre-sleep routine is another important technique. So there's many different things that we can do. And as I mentioned, you can't just flip a switch and expect to fall asleep. It takes time for the mind and body to prepare for sleep. So we typically recommend about an hour before bed to start that pre-sleep routine. So this is going to be important for athletes to be able to fall asleep quicker. But it'll also help in situations when they're traveling, they're sleeping in a new environment. And, this is a way that they can have some stability and routine in their pre-sleep routine, which will help them fall asleep quicker and have better sleep quality. So there's a couple of different techniques that I put on here. So number 1, turning off electronic devices and dimming lights. Prepare for the next day. So many athletes may think, well, what am I supposed to do in that hour? They're so bored because they can't look at their electronic devices. I think preparing for the next day is a good thing to do. So packing that gym bag, packing your lunch, doing those kind of things to allow you more opportunity to sleep in the morning. So doing anything that you can do in the morning, kind of move that to the evening, will give you a greater chance to sleep in a little bit more too. Taking a warm bath or shower. So this has been shown to reduce the time it takes you to fall asleep, because what happens when we do go to sleep is our body temperature drops. And by having a warm bath or shower 60 to 90 minutes before our bedtime, it temporarily increases our body temperature, but then our body temperature drops, which mimics what we need to do when we fall asleep. And then relaxing activities. So some of the things that's been shown to be beneficial in the research at reducing the time it takes to fall asleep, as well as improving sleep quality, are a gratitude journal. So what they find in this particular study was that those who had a gratitude journal offloaded more of those negative thoughts and increased the number of positive thoughts, which helped them in their sleep quality. Writing a to-do list. A study found that writing a to-do list right before bedtime, within 5 minutes of bedtime, was more beneficial for sleep latency, falling asleep, than those who simply just wrote about their day. So writing a to-do list in particular helps offload those thoughts off of our mind to make it easier to fall asleep. Having breathing exercises, maybe progressive muscle relaxation, some stretching, even reading a paper book, all help activate that parasympathetic nervous system, our relaxation system. Providing nap opportunities is really important. So the benefits of naps, we know that it reduces sleepiness, it heightens alertness, increases concentration, enhances motor performance, and boosts mood. But not many athletes are actually doing this. And in our study of 200 Canadian national team athletes, we found that a third of the athletes don't nap, and only about 80% nap more than or less than 1 to 2 times per week. So only about 20% were napping 3 or more times per week. So this is a huge area for athletes to take advantage of. Duration of the nap. So we want the nap to be primarily short if you have a shorter opportunity. So about 20 minutes. And that's so that you're not getting into the deeper stages of sleep. If you have a longer opportunity, we can do more of a 90-minute full sleep cycle. And in this case, you wouldn't want to set an alarm. You'd want to wake up naturally, maybe set an emergency alarm in those cases. The environment, we want it to be cool, dark, and quiet, similar to a cave. So we want it cool, we want it dark, potentially having an eye mask to block out some of that daytime light, and then quiet with headphones, maybe with white noise if you're in a noisy area, or earplugs. And I didn't mention the timing of the nap. So the timing of the nap, we want that to be between the hours of 1 and 4 p.m. Because that is also in line with our circadian rhythm when we start to see a drop in our alertness in line with our circadian rhythm in the afternoon. And as well as it's not too close to the nighttime sleep period. So once we start taking naps, 5, 6 p.m., we're looking at it's just too close to when we would normally fall asleep. So we want to keep that timing of the nap between 1 and 4 p.m. Again, we can use those techniques to help fall asleep that I mentioned earlier, writing a to-do list, potentially doing the 4-7-8 breathing technique, where you breathe in for 4 seconds, hold your breath for 7, breathe out for 8. That helps activate the parasympathetic nervous system. Any kind of deep breathing techniques, progressive muscle relaxation, or even the cognitive shuffle, which is a personal favorite of mine, where you think of words such as bedtime, you imagine all the objects that you can, starting with B, ball, baby, bat, bus, banana. And then when you can't think of any more objects, you move on to E, so eagle, egg, ear. And by the time you get to the end of the word, you'll be sound asleep. So, and that's a technique that is what is kind of naturally occurring when we fall asleep, is we kind of imagine shapes and objects. And so that's a way to help you fall asleep a little bit quicker for a nap, or if you're just waking up during the middle of the night. I want to touch on using caffeine strategically. 200 milligrams of caffeine at 7 a.m. led to decreases in sleep, a greater time to fall asleep, a decrease in continuity of sleep, and a decrease in deep sleep brainwaves in this particular study. So this is an extreme example, I think, and this was in people who normally drank about 2 cups of coffee, but they were not on caffeine prior to the study. So, I think it's just important to keep in mind that sleep does impact our sleep quality, whether or not you think it affects you or not. But there are impacts on our overall sleep quality when we're consuming caffeine. In athletes in particular, in this particular study by Dr. Dunican in 2018 found that 20% of Super Rugby athletes pulled all-nighters after consuming caffeine during an evening game. So I think it can do more damage than just sleep quality. And in particular in athletes, they think caffeine is, amazing for their performance, but there are negative impacts. And in this study, 20% of the athletes actually pulled an all-nighter after consuming caffeine during that evening game. Of course, there's more factors than just the caffeine, but it's something to keep in mind. And I really love this study by Dr. Guest in 2018, found that 4 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram prior to a cycling time trial impaired performance by 14% compared to placebo in slow metabolizers of caffeine. So there are, based on our genetics, there are ways that caffeine works for us or not. And in this particular study, the slow metabolizers of caffeine, actually their performance was worse when they used caffeine about an hour before that cycling time trial. So it's not, of course, in the fast metabolizers, it works very well. So potentially having athletes know whether or not they're a slow or a fast metabolizer may be useful in recommending caffeine or not. So just to summarize, sleep tactics, what can you do? This is what we talked about. You want to make sure that you educate and emphasize the importance of sleep as a strategy. Do frequent check-ins with your athletes, have more of a formal sleep presentation if you can, maybe 2 times throughout the season, and then do informal check-ins with your athletes. Potentially, we didn't talk about monitoring sleep at all, but I think I didn't talk about wearables, but a lot of people ask, should I be wearing a sleep watch? Should I be monitoring? In my opinion, I think if it helps you, helps your behavior change, then that would be useful, wearing a sleep wearable. We have to be careful of, though, how accurate the device is. And bottom line, the research is showing that they're not super accurate, so people need to be aware of that. And then also, I wouldn't use a sleep wearable for an anxious athlete who might look at their watch and think, oh no, I got a terrible night's sleep. This is going to definitely impact my performance. So I think you have to be careful who you're using the wearables for and how that might affect behavior change. Monitor sleep and get help when needed. That's related to that as well, using a wearable sleep device. But remember, have your athletes use the athlete sleep screening questionnaire. It's freely available, and it'll help you identify who has a sleep problem or not, and who needs to get further help from a sleep specialist. And you could do that maybe 2 times throughout the season, preseason and maybe postseason. Or preseason or during the season might be a good time to monitor sleep. And then also you could look at more daily measures of gauging sleep to see patterns of when an athlete might be doing overtraining. And so maybe even just a simple, how much did you sleep last night, could be an additional supplement that you can use, that you ask more on a daily basis. Banking sleep is important, so getting more sleep by going to bed earlier or taking naps during the day, or even sleeping in a little bit, no more than an hour and a half, can be a way to bank sleep leading into that important competition, which will help improve performance and prevent that poor night of sleep prior to the competition being able to affect the athlete. Having a pre-sleep routine plan. So I mentioned all of those different techniques, starting with the putting away the electronic devices. And one thing you might also incorporate is a bedtime alarm. So have your athletes set an alarm about 60 minutes or an hour before they want to be in bed. And that's a signal for them to put away those electronic devices and start that pre-sleep or unwind routine. And then provide napping opportunities. So make suggestions for athletes depending on their schedule of when they could fit in a nap. And it doesn't have to be anything long, or it could be, go out to your car and take a nap in your car for 10 minutes. It doesn't have to be anything extravagant like having a nap in recovery room or anything along those lines, but try and find areas for your athletes to take naps. And that's going to be really beneficial for their performance. If I didn't mention this, but if your athlete is swimmer, for example, and they have to be awake very early to be in the pool, this would be a time where athletes would want to schedule in a longer nap opportunity every single day to make up for some of that lost sleep at night. And then again, use caffeine strategically. Don't use it automatically. It impacts different people depending on how they metabolize it. So be cognizant of that, and that caffeine is not always going to help that slow metabolizer. That's all I have. I thank you for your attention. You can get in touch with me at sleepforsport@gmail.com, or I'm on social media at sleepforsport. And I'm also working on a website that's not quite ready yet, but look out for that. It's called sleepwelltowin.com. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you again for attending, and a special thank you to Dr. Amy Bender and the Gatorade Sports Science Institute for supporting this webinar. As a final reminder, please complete the short survey and the 15-question self-test. Upon passing the self-test, you will receive your CEC certificate via email, and your CEC will automatically be added to your ACSM profile. Have a great afternoon. This concludes today's webinar.